Seneca's conception of human nature isn't essentially different from that of Cicero, though it may be elaborated in greater detail. We are all essentially equal. No one is a slave by nature. Slavery is the result of misfortune affecting only the body but not the whole man. Seneca gives us an account of man's original condition that is, in a secular mode, very much like the Christian story of the fall. In this he differs from Cicero to the extent that Cicero has no developed idea of such a state of innocence, and such material as we find in his writings that might relate to such a conception are underdeveloped. Seneca's view is, in all important points, the same as that of the Christian fathers, that man was once innocent and happy, but has grown corrupt. Before the emergence of conventions, men lived in peace and happiness, without slavery and without coercive government. However, this state of innocence is disrupted by the emergence of avarice and uncontrolled desire. The natural voluntary subordination of the not-so-wise to the wise is replaced by tyranny, so that men have to have recourse to laws to exercise some control over their rulers. Property and coercive government emerge from the loss of our original innocence, and yet, somewhat paradoxically, are remedies for it as well. Seneca holds of the great institutions of society, property and coercive government, namely, that they are the consequences of and the remedies for vice. In fact, with the addition of slavery to property and coercive government, this view is a commonplace among the Christian fathers. Slavery, private property, and coercive government are not aspects of man's original social condition, but are the product of some lapse from innocence, some fall from grace. Seneca, as Cicero, holds to what one might term a republican theory of liberty. Whatever about man's natural condition, in the realities of a post-innocent society, liberty is essentially related to one's being a member of a suitably constituted state. Carlyle sees the political theory of the Middle Ages as having its origin in three sources: the writings of the Roman lawyers, the thought of the Christian fathers, and, from my point of view most significantly, from the tribal law and customs of the post-Western Roman Empire barbarian invaders. We will look at the latter two sources a little later. Let's now take a look at the thought of the Roman lawyers. While the Roman jurists do not formally belong to any one philosophical school, it is nevertheless the case that their conceptions of justice and law align them more with the Stoics than with any other schools such as the Epicureans or the academic skeptics. In the great collection of Roman law compiled under Justinian, the Digest, the Institutes, and the Code, in the 6th century AD, we can witness the development of the thought of the Roman jurisconsults. We also have the Institutes of the 2nd century jurisconsult Gaius, not just the fragments preserved in the Digest, as is the case with the other jurisconsults. This gives us a valuable point of comparison. What is of interest to us in these writers is not the detail of law, but their conception of what the law is. Their common word for what we call law, generally understood, was jus. When they wanted to refer to a specific enactment of a legislative body, they generally used the term lex. In their writing, we find them talking about jus naturale, jus gentium, and jus civile, which we might translate respectively as the law of nature or natural law, the law of nations, and the civil law or the law of the city. What constitutes the jus civile isn't really a matter of much dispute, though its relation to the other two kinds of law is a matter of great interest. However, the distinction between the other two kinds of law, the jus naturale and the jus gentium, is controversial, and we find differing accounts of them in the writings of the jurisconsults. Gaius sees no essential difference between the jus naturale and the jus gentium, whereas Ulpian, a slightly later 2nd century AD jurist, distinguished between them. Of these two views, Ulpian's was the one to triumph, albeit with some modifications. Gaius's view of the jus gentium is that this is a kind of universal law which embodies natural reason. the principles of this law of nations are given to man from the beginning. Gaius' Jus Gentium is that body of principles or laws which men have always learned from their reason to recognize as useful and just. The Jus Gentium is primitive, universal, rational, and equitable. To the extent that Gaius talks of Jus Naturale, which isn't often, it appears to amount to much the same thing as Jus Gentium. In thinking of the Jus Gentium as rational and universal, Gaius is very close to the Ciceronian conception. For both men, law is not essentially a matter of anyone's will, but rather a matter of the rational apprehension of a pre-existing order. The division between voluntaristic and rationalistic conceptions of law is a permanent and recurring feature of all jurisprudence then and now. At the beginning of the 3rd century AD, a distinction begins to be drawn between Jus Naturale and Jus Gentium. We find this particularly in the contributions of Ulpian, and while his distinction between the two kinds of law becomes a commonplace of subsequent thought, his manner of drawing the distinction has been a source of confusion. For him, the Jus Naturale is whatever nature teaches all animals, including man. Natural law thus covers procreation and the care of offspring, both in animals and man. The Jus Gentium, by contrast, is peculiar to and is common to all nations, not just to Rome. As Ulpian thinks of it, the Jus Naturale is more a matter of instinct than reason. However, in other uses of this term, Ulpian characterizes Jus Naturale in a manner that makes sense only if it is understood rationally, so that it would then have to be peculiar to man and not common to man and animal alike. Ulpian's companion jurisconsults, while they generally, but not always, draw a distinction between Jus Naturale and Jus Gentium, are no more conspicuously successful in characterizing the distinction clearly than he is. By the time we get to the 4th century AD, matters have become a little clearer. By this time, the distinction is made to correspond to a distinction between what belongs to man by nature and that which belongs to him by convention. So, for example, man by nature is free and equal, but in the actual conditions of human life, war and slavery have arisen, and around these circumstances, the law of nations has developed. The distinction between the two kinds of law has particular application to the matter of slavery. For the Roman jurisconsults, slavery is not, as it would have been for Aristotle, something natural, pertaining to the original condition of man, but something that arose with the development of complex societies, and which is in some way a consequence of human failings. Slavery took a long time to disappear, and its eventual demise may well be attributed to fundamental changes in the economic circumstances of men. Nevertheless, we find in the Roman lawyers a rejection of the naturalness of slavery that, together with the similar rejection of slavery's naturalness in the fathers of the Church, makes some contribution to slavery's eventual eradication. However, while the jurists and the Church Fathers all rejected the naturalness of slavery, they all continued to support the institution of slavery. That slavery should be the consequence of some declension from the right and the good seems plausible, whether in a secular or religious story. That slavery should be the cure for the very deficiencies giving rise to itself seems to be bizarrely circular. Those who distinguish sharply between the Jus Naturale and the Jus Gentium tend to see private property as an institution of the Jus Gentium rather than the Jus Naturale. They hold that in man's original condition, all things were held in common. Those who do not make such a sharp distinction between the two kinds of law, such as Gaius and Paulus, tend to see private property as being both primitive and equitable. Cicero's conception of the law is one that resonates through the Middle Ages and is reflected in the sophisticated analysis of St. Thomas in the 13th century. For Cicero, all law is in some sense a reflection of the law of God, of the eternal principles of justice. Any law that essentially contradicts these principles is not just a bad law, but is no law at all. The law of the city, the civil law, is an adaptation of these principles to the particular circumstances of a particular people at a particular time. Thus understood, civil law comes down on the rationalistic side of the rationalistic voluntaristic debate. It is not just the will of a person or a community, it is the application to a community of the universal principles of justice. Cicero tended to conceive of liberty as the having of a share in the state. The Roman lawyers tended to think of the populace as a whole as the ultimate source of authority, even if, as Ulpian states so plainly in the Digest, its proximate source is the emperor. A decision given by the emperor, he says, has the force of a statute. This is because the populace commits to him and unto him its own entire authority and power, doing this by the lex regia. Carlyle notes that, with the exception of the senatus consultum, every form of law derives its authority ultimately from the populace. This idea of a popular source for imperial authority, really a somewhat attenuated theory of consent, could provide the starting point for a theory of contract, but it wasn't so developed by the Roman jurisconsults. Instead, the contract theory first appears in recognizable form in the 11th century, and then its most immediate source is the law of the tribes rather than any Roman source.